So welcome to this classic sailor feature where we're going to be talking about the replica French three-masted sailing frigate Hermione, or L'Hermione as the French would pronounce her. Launched in 2014, she's a faithful copy of a famous 18th century frigate of the same name, and she's crewed by around 80 mostly volunteer sailors who have sailed her to many countries so far, almost always as an ambassador of historic France or an example of living history as they recreate the maritime heritage that she represents. And I'm joined by the photographer Nigel Pert, who spends a lot of time in his house in France. He's speaking to us from Burjou in the Swiss Normande. Nigel, you started covering, should we call her L'Hermione or should we call her Hermione and be British about it?
You can call her whatever you wish, Mr. Houston. L'Hermione.
L'Hermione.
I have difficulty with that when I'm talking with English people about her. I never know whether to call it the Hermione or L'Hermione.
She was built in 1779. She's a light frigate. The frigate was a fast, maneuverable, fairly shoal draft ship used around the fleets of the larger vessels. She achieved fame with Lafayette, who was the French soldier who went to help the American Revolution.
That was the purpose of the voyage with Hermione, was to go and tell George Washington that the French were indeed going to come in and help them with financial and physical aid of other ships and so on in the fight of the independence, yeah.
She helped, I think, the last blockade with Cornwallis got holed up in Yorktown, and she helped with right. Which is 1781, I think. So the year after she got over there, and she'd been blockading and fighting. She had quite a busy time. So she's obviously very famous in France, and she's famous in the States too. And that's the reason they built her, is it? This replica.
It's part of the reason that, they decided to build a replica of a boat that had been built in Rochefort. It was deemed to be a good strategic point to build ships because it was a few miles up the river of Charente, so very, very well protected. And it became one of the major centres of military shipbuilding in France. And this had fallen into ruin, and the town was looking for something to attract people back into the town because the French naval presence lasted in Rochefort up until about the Second World War. But after that, there was virtually nothing left in the town. So they were searching for a project to bring people back, and a group of people decided to renovate one of the dry docks and build a ship in it. The basic structure of the dry docks was still good, and they chose the Hermione because of the historical connection of the voyage of Lafayette, and because Hermione was probably the pinnacle of that type of boat, because it was one of the fastest ever built of sailing ships.
It's famous for her speed, yeah.
Yeah, absolutely.
She was one of a class, wasn't she?
Yeah, there was the Concorde class, of which there were 3 built, but the French didn't have any plans for the boat anywhere. But the Concorde had been captured by the British, taken back to England, and the lines taken off, and those lines still are in the Greenwich Maritime Museum. So that means the boat, identical to the one they wanted to build, there were plans available. Around about 1980, I think they first started getting the idea together, something like 82 or something like that. The association was formed. It takes a long time to get a project like that off the ground.
And they didn't start until 1997.
That's correct. The actual building was started in 1997, in July of 97.
That was the building of the ship, and before that they'd had to do a lot of work to Rochefort itself.
Yeah, they had to get the site prepared and so on. Overall, throughout the years that it was being built, the main source of finance was entrance fees of people who came to watch it being built, because they closed the site off, basically built a tent over the dry dock, and there was a sort of a viewing platform and circuit to take, and people paid an entrance fee to come and see the people working on it. Right from the start, it was purposely planned out that it would be done over a fairly long period, so as the works could progress as the money came in, because they realised they wouldn't get all the funding in the first year or so. Initially, they were talking about 10 years. That actually panned out to 17 years.
I was quite interested to read that the original Hermione, built in Rochefort, had taken just 11 months, and they didn't have power tools.
They did have a lot of blokes that didn't work for anything there.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, they worked for an apple a day, those French peasants, didn't they?
Oh, yeah.
So they built this amazing ship over 17 years. When you go aboard her, is she really like something from the 18th century?
Well, I wasn't there at the time to be actually at least sure, but I imagine it was pretty close. Right from the start, they always said that visually it should be exactly as was. And to all intents and purposes, it is. It's got an engine, which of course it didn't have in the 18th century.
You know, for instance, when you go aboard, does it smell of hemp and tar?
Absolutely, because everything is hemp and tar. If you put the motor and the navigational equipment aside, it is exactly as was. And the security equipment, because it's got a semi-inflatable man overboard rescue dinghy, of course.
And electric light? Has it got electric light?
Yes, I mean it's got its power source for propulsion is electric motors. So there's generators to run the electric motors, but then they also provide normal 240 volt power system throughout the whole vessel. Yeah.
And she's had to be coded by the French Coast Guard for passengers and for people to be aboard. So presumably there's quite a lot of modern safety equipment that would be
absolutely
not necessarily recognised by an 18th century sailor. What sort of things they got? I mean, apart from life jackets, say, is it obvious the stuff they've got, or not too obvious?
Any sailor going on board will see the stuff, but the public just going around wouldn't really notice. No, I mean there's very discreet sort of antennas for the GPS and all that sort of stuff. There's a radar up in the mast, but you know you'd be hard pushed to see it's there, sort of thing. And all the life jackets, they're all in parts which would have had other things in at the time.
Yeah, great. So it's got a real feel of the time. I'm quite interested in this thing called living history, you know, and living history is recreating a ship of the 18th century in such a way that it's fairly authentic. I suppose the ship needs to be reasonably safe, obviously, to comply with regulations, but it also needs to be authentic, doesn't it, to actually appeal? Yeah. And the good thing about Hermione is I know I've seen her several times on the dock in France or at the Brest Festival in 2016, for instance, and she did look absolutely amazing. And you go up this painted gangplank and you meet the crew and they're in period, I was going to say costume, but it's not costume, is it? They're just in period dress. They're in their sailcloth clothes, and that does have a fantastic effect, I think, on the public.
Funny you saying that. One of the first tour ships I sailed on was the replica of the Golden Hind, who did all their sailing in period costume. With the L'Hermione, we get into costume when we arrive in port and leave, but we don't generally sail in costume. Yeah. Except we have one guy on board all the crossing, a guy who's an American, in fact, and he's a history student specialising in costume, in fact, and he did the whole voyage in authentic clothes, complete set of authentic. In fact, he lives his life in authentic clothes. That's real living history. He was really finding out what it was like, you know, the really bad weather and everything. He was there with just his wool greatcoat and so on. Yeah.
And you went sailing on L'Hermione when she was first She was launched, was it at the end of 2014?
I sailed with them from Bordeaux up to Brest in, as you say, 2014, and it was the first time they hit bad weather. I think we were about 100 miles off the west coast of France and south coast of Brittany, and we had about 478 for a couple of days.
Under sail?
Yeah, of course, yeah.
Yeah.
It was quite impressive. Took them about an hour to reef the mainsail.
Where did they get the crew from? Were the crew working on her already, or did they just arrive?
Well, probably half of the professional crew had been working on the construction site, finishing off the rigging and so on, and some of them had been there for quite a few years already. And some of the officers and boatswain and the captain had gone on various other vaguely similar boats, because there aren't really many. They'd sailed on the Göteborg in Sweden and on the Standard, which is a much smaller version of Hermione.
So the skipper, Jan Currieu, he's quite a character, isn't he? So he'd come from other ships and he'd sailed the Göteborg first to get a feel for something similar, of similar size, yeah?
He was 30 years in the Navy, the French Navy, during which time he sailed quite a lot with their sail training ships, because as you know, the French Navy's got 5 sailing vessels for training officers on. He was captain of the Mutin, I think, and he was definitely captain of the Étoile for a couple of years. And when he retired from the Navy, he took the command of the French three-masted bark, the Belém, for 18 months or a couple of years. Yeah. And he left that when the Hermione project got off the ground.
Yeah.
But he had been on the technical advisory committee of Hermione for quite a while anyway. And he was quite instrumental in them taking the natural rigging route, for example. He went up to Sweden and talked to the guys from Göteborg who had done the rigging of Göteborg.
I was looking back at the piece that we did in one of the early issues of Classic Sailor, when I think he said he was talking about them all being neophytes to a certain degree, and how actually, you know, he preferred it. He said he had, I can't remember how many, there were 13 professionals, I think, or him and 13 professionals.
Yeah, that's right. I always say that there's basically 80 people on board, 15 professional crew and 65 volunteers.
So more than something like a tea clipper. Crewed by 20.
Oh, yeah, I mean,
if that.
Yeah. You couldn't sail Hermione with 20 people.
No.
You're struggling to sail it with 80 people, because don't forget, in the late 1700s, they had 200 to 300 people on board to sail it.
Yeah.
Admittedly, a lot of them would have been soldiers that were going to just get off and fight on land, but and cannon operators and so on. But they had stud sails as well at that time, but which the current one hasn't yet.
Yeah. He described this sort of learning curve, how he said people had to sort of forget, you know, what they'd known before and really learn how to sail this ship afresh. But he said it was during the summer's 4-month voyage that the fullness of the marine qualities of this frigate, retrieved from the clutches of history, were fully revealed. He's quite a flowery guy, isn't he? He said, we can now better appreciate the knowledge of naval architecture and shipbuilding at the end of the 17th century. I think then he basically, you know, talks about how handy they found the boat, and how actually, once they'd learned how to sail her, how maneuverable she was, which is not something you associate with fully square-rigged vessels of that time. You get the feeling that they would only sail downwind or across it at best, but it sounds like he really learned how to handle her.
Yeah, I mean, I think we've got a preconception which is definitely not right.
Well, it seems like it was a great thing for those guys. The big event, of course, with L'Hermione was actually crossing the Atlantic in the summer of 2015 to sort of recreate the Lafayette voyage.
The trip last year in the Atlantic, going down to the Mediterranean, was another very big event with force 8, 9, 10s all the time, basically, for 2 weeks.
Was that worse than the transatlantic in the first place?
Oh yeah, definitely much worse. I mean, I wasn't on board for the return transatlantic trip, which was quite bad in itself. But I noticed in that previous article, there's a phrase where he's talking about the handling. He says it heeled to 8 degrees in February of last year. The highest that we recorded was 45 degrees.
What does he say? The frigate also showed the ability to sail to windward 65 to 55 to the true wind angle. That's extraordinary. Her low drift going to windward 3 degrees to 4 degrees, and a large capacity to maneuver even at low speeds, and her low heel angle less than 8 degrees. Yes, you're right. She must have a huge amount of ballast. Maybe she's just very stiff. They say the best 24-hour period was 245 miles, giving an average speed of 10.2 knots, and the best 12-hour period they had was 130 miles, which was 10.8 knots. The best watch run that they did during that trip was 45 miles. So 45 miles in 4 hours. That's trucking, and that's 11 1/4 knots. And they reckoned that the highest speed they actually registered, I take it this is going through the water, not just GPS, was 13.3 knots. And at the end of that, he was pretty convinced. This was an interview conducted, I think, in 2015. At the end of that, he said, "We're now certain that she can go faster."
Yeah.
These ships were not slouches at all, were they? They were fast and handy vessels. What happened when you got to America in 2015?
As we arrived, we anchored off because we were a little bit ahead of schedule, about 24 hours or so ahead of schedule. So we dropped anchor about 12 miles off the American coast, not far from Norfolk. When we up anchored from there, we went into Norfolk for like a technical stopover, empty tanks, fill tanks and so on, and get other supplies and stuff like that. We were there for about 2 or 3 days. And then we made our first official landfall at Yorktown, where, as you said, there was this famous battle and so on. A lot of dignitaries came over from France. The governor of Virginia was there, and, all the protocol. And there was a first change of crew since the Canaries. I was part of that because I left the boat at that point. And I went back to New York for the arrival of L'Hermione in New York, and I staked out a place where I'd get a good view of her passing the Statue of Liberty.
All a big deal for détente between France and the States, brothers.
Yeah. And of course, they always subtitled the boat the Frigate of Liberty. And last year's voyage was done in conjunction with the OEF, Organisation Internationale de la Francophonie, so the International Organization of French-speaking Nations. And during the 5 months voyage last year, there were volunteer crew members from 34 different countries, I believe, where French is spoken. A lot of youngsters came on board.
And you joined up with that cruise as well to the Mediterranean?
I did the first leg, or found the first 2 legs. I set sail with them from La Rochelle, leaving in February to go to Tangiers, and then I did the next leg from Tangiers to Sète, where there was the festival Escala Sète, and it was pretty horrendous weather all the way. We came into the Mediterranean. It was about force 10, 11 blowing in the Straits of Gibraltar, and although Tangiers had accepted that we could go into port, we just couldn't do it because of the wind angle and everything and the sea state. So we sailed straight on through the Straits of Gibraltar and holed up behind La Ceuta, just on anchor watch all the time, with both motors going and 2 anchors out. There wasn't a great deal of interchange directly with the ship and the public of Tangiers.
You don't associate in those populations with sort of sailing tall ships, do you? Yet.
I think if the possibility had been there, I think there would have been visits.
Okay, maybe a slight chance lost there.
Yeah.
I saw some hammocks in some of your photos.
Yeah.
Where do people sleep, and what's it like?
Yeah, sleeping. There's about a third of the crew sleep in hammocks, and the other 2/3 are in bunk beds, cot type things. Yeah, and the officers have got a cabin. There's now 8 places for paying guests, shall we say?
You can actually book a voyage on her.
Yeah. It's very expensive, but it really needs the money. So
I saw those pictures that you'd done of the officers' quarters, and they look actually fairly comfortable. They also look very authentic. I noticed, I think it was the captain's cabin, where it really did look like they'd found 18th century furniture and furnished it with a corner cabinet and some form of armoire and a desk that really did look like it was from that time.
Talking about that, the captain's quarters and the grand chambre, as they call it, the big saloon and the table and everything, all that is demountable. You can take it all down in, how quick you are, 20 minutes to be ready for action. All those partitions there, they're all just held by little bolts into the floor.
And I think she's based on it's 32 guns. That's the idea. Are they? Some of them fire, but are they all firing?
They're all capable of making a bang, but they're not capable of firing a cannonball. But they're only bored out to 60 centimeters or something like that. So you can put a large banger in it and a bit of wadding, so as it
you get a sound.
Yeah. A very realistic sound.
So I've seen the guns, and they have like mess tables between them. They don't actually fully mess in those. Spaces.
That's not sleeping quarters. No, the sleeping quarters are on the next deck down.
You get a good meal on board, I take it.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Good variety, plenty of it.
Do you get a sundowner if you're aboard? Do you get a rum ration?
No, it's a dry ship.
Oh, okay.
No good for you, Dan.
All the more reason to get somewhere quick, I suppose. Yeah.
It's a dry ship, but it's not a killjoy ship. Or during long voyages, Sunday is deemed a day of rest, and just essential work is done. And during the crossing, the one watch had to entertain the other 2. So from nothing at all, they invented all sorts of things. It's just absolutely incredible. Last year, they actually did the trial of a sailor, and that they're all dressed up in their uniform, the captain, the chief mechanic, and everybody, and they tried this poor sailor, and they keel-hauled him in the end.
Wow. How did that work out? Did he actually get in the water?
No, it was a dummy.
Oh.
It shows the inventiveness. The dummy was just a set of oilies stuffed with I don't know what.
Keel-hauling a dummy. That's a terrifying thought. That's living history, or dying history, actually, isn't it? Keel hauling.
Yeah, quite. That wasn't keel hauling. It was, you used another word where you don't actually take them right under the boat. You just drop them in and soak them for a bit and then pull them up.
Well, and how is discipline maintained with so many volunteers?
Because everybody's there because they want to be there. Everybody knows that, everybody depends on everybody else. And I mean, I've sailed on board 4 times now. I've never seen an argument between anyone. It's just incredible.
Well, it's an interesting fact. Someone in the Sail Training Association, I think, was telling me when these tall ships get into port, you've got thousands of young people. They're coming ashore into a, native population that hasn't been away at sea or enjoying some of the thrills of tall ship sailing. And he said, yet the crime rate goes down when the tall ships come into port. And I thought that was just an extraordinary statistic. So not only are the young guys coming ashore, and girls, not only are the young people coming ashore and behaving themselves what would appear to be perfectly, but the local population seems to give up its ideas of any malfeasance because of this skyline of masts and moonrakers and topgallants and all the rest of it. It's a lovely idea, isn't it? It's a fantastic idea.
Sure, that's true, yeah.
Very healthy for everyone concerned.
You mentioned girls there. That's during the a transatlantic crossing, and I think there was about 30% of the crew was female. Last year, and on the voyage down to the Mediterranean, there was nearly 50% girl crew. I don't know if there's positive discrimination. I don't think so. I mean, basically, it's Jan Carrier who selects the crew. Yes. From the letters that they send, because I mean that's the process. The process is send a letter explaining why you want to do it. There's an initial weekend where they do the height test, where you have to climb up the rigging. If you can't do that, you're out straight away.
I know people go on to do great things. I think it was your photograph actually, Nigel, in our 4th issue, which was the cover girl was the helmsman.
Well, everybody's a helmsman in the Hermione except me. I still haven't had a go yet, but yes, I do. Manon.
She'd gone on to be a mate of the Cascalot. So that's just one person I know. But people obviously getting quite good jobs. They're getting almost like careers out of this, are they?
Well, absolutely, because I mean, she wasn't a qualified sailor at the time of that picture, because she was just one of the volunteer crew. Straight after the transatlantic trip, I think her and about 15 others went and did the initial able seaman's qualifications, and as you say, she's gone on to higher things, and it's been the same each year since.
You learn a whole range of skills if you go sailing on the Hermione.
That's absolutely true. Yeah, absolutely true.
I noticed that we've slipped back into calling her the Hermione in our British way. We can't really stick with Hermione, just as like you say Gay Paris once, don't you? But then you come back to Paris. I was just going to mention some of the statistics. Apparently she's built of 2,000 oak trees. The original sails would have been hemp, but the replicas are in linen, and it says they need to be unfurled and dried whenever they're used. So she has to hang out her sails to dry, and the rigging is 28 kilometers of rope consisting of manila, hemp, and halliards and topping lifts are in synthetic fibers for safety. So they've had a nod to modernity. They don't want any of those big bits of gear dropping onto the deck and killing someone.
I'm sure that's to comply with the equivalent of Lloyd's.
Yeah, they'd have made them do that, definitely.
They send inspectors all the time.
Yeah, well, safety first. It's got to be the case.
Yeah, I mean, in all the sea miles that she's done already, there's never been a serious accident so far, touch wood. Yeah. Nor have they broken anything. I mean, she sailed in force 10, not broken a spar or anything.
That's pretty unusual, actually.
And it seems that a lot of it is to do with the fact that it was finally accepted that she was made with traditional rigging materials, because there's the flexibility. Even on a boat that big, you go up to the shrouds and you shake the shrouds and you see the mast sort of wobble.
Those materials they worked at the time. There was nothing wrong with them at the time. They were just superseded with things that didn't get mildew during the winter.
That were cheaper.
And didn't and of course were cheaper. But unfortunately, which are now shedding microfibers all over our oceans. It's nice to see that she's all natural. Well, that's great to talk about Hermione. She's a very interesting piece of living history. One only wishes that we could have something as authentic ourselves. The French are sort of stealing a march, really, in that sense of having these fantastic-looking ships at all their superb maritime festivals, the like of which we seem to have forgotten to even stage in this country. We haven't seen a Festival of the Sea since 2005.
I was going to say this year Hermione is leaving La Rochelle on the 27th of April to do a tour around Brittany and Normandy. That's because there's the tall ships meeting in Rouen in June this year, which of course L'Hermione is the star guest. I'm going to sail again this year. I'll be doing the first leg from La Rochelle to Cherbourg. Cherbourg is the 5th to the 9th of May. She will be in Ouistreham from the 14th to the 16th of May. She'll also be in Dieppe, 11th to the 12th of May. She'll be in Dieppe. And then she sails into Rouen, as do many other boats, on the 7th of June. It's not impossible that she'll come and do a little foray into English waters.
Well, that's the story of the Hermione, or L'Hermione, the replica French frigate built in Rochefort, like the original, launched in 2014. The original was launched in 1779. Bit of living history repeated. That's the story with Nigel Pert, speaking from La Belle France. Thanks, Nigel. Nice to hear your experiences of L'Hermione.